There's a thought you've never told anyone. Maybe it flashed through your mind while you were standing on a balcony. Maybe it appeared while you were holding something sharp, or driving next to a concrete barrier, or sitting next to someone you love. It arrived without warning. It made no sense, and the moment it did, you felt a cold wave of shame. Because what kind of person thinks something like that? You pushed it away, and for a while, it left. But it came back. It always comes back. And every time it does, it gets a little louder, a little harder to shake, and the shame gets a little heavier. Here's what nobody tells you about that thought. The pushing, the fighting, the suppressing, the desperate attempt to not think about it, that's not protecting you. That's feeding it. And the science behind why that's true is one of the most counterintuitive, and ultimately, one of the most liberating discoveries in modern psychology. In 1987, a psychologist named Daniel Wegner ran a simple experiment. He told a group of people to sit quietly and think about anything they wanted, but under no circumstances were they allowed to think about a white bear. If the thought entered their mind, they had to ring a bell. The bells rang constantly. Then he flipped the experiment. He told a second group they could think about a white bear as freely as they wanted. No restrictions. Afterwards, both groups were told to think about whatever they liked. The group that had been suppressing the bear thought was now consumed by it. They couldn't stop. The very act of trying not to think about something had made it louder, more intrusive, more persistent. Wegner called this the rebound effect. He later developed what he called are not a symptom. They are, and likely have always been, part of what it means to have a human mind. Here's the part that will stay with you. In 2014, researchers also confirmed something called the high place phenomenon, which the French had already given a far more beautiful name. L'appel du vide, the call of the void. It describes that fleeting impulse you feel when you're standing at a cliff edge, or on a tall building, or near a fast-moving train. The sudden, inexplicable urge to jump, even when you have no desire whatsoever to do so. Studies found that over 50% of people have experienced this. And here's the part that shocks most people. It was common even among people who had never, in their entire lives, had a suicidal thought. The researcher who studied it most closely, April Smith of Miami University, ironic process theory. The idea that your brain uses a monitoring system to check whether a bad thought has appeared. And that checking system keeps activating the very thought you're trying to avoid. This effect has been replicated over and over, with targets as absurd as a green rabbit. The outcome is always the same, every single time. But here's where it gets stranger, and far more important. Researchers at the University of Cambridge discovered that the ability to dismiss unwanted thoughts isn't purely psychological. It's neurochemical. Specifically, it depends on levels of GABA, a neurotransmitter, in the hippocampus. People with lower concentrations of it struggle significantly more to inhibit intrusive thoughts. This means that if dark thoughts keep visiting you, despite every effort to push them away, it is not a moral failure. It is not evidence of something broken or dangerous inside you. It is your brain chemistry, shaped by genetics, environment, stress, and sleep. And it is something that can be addressed. The struggle is not a character flaw. It is a biological signal asking for a different approach. Now I want to give you something, a piece of data that has genuinely changed how researchers and therapists understand the human mind. In 2014, a multinational team of researchers interviewed 777 people across 13 countries and 6 continents. People from radically different cultures, religions, and backgrounds. And they asked them about their inner lives, specifically about the unwanted, disturbing thoughts that entered their heads. Every single culture had them. Every country. Every background. Intrusive thoughts, including violent ones, sexual ones, and thoughts of self-destruction, were found to be universal. Not rare. Not a sign of disorder. Universal. And this wasn't a new discovery so much as a confirmation of something psychologist Stanley Rachman had started to suspect decades earlier. Rachman gave a detailed questionnaire to completely healthy college students, people with no psychological diagnoses, no history of trauma, no red flags, and asked them whether they'd ever experienced certain kinds of thoughts. Nearly all of them had. Thoughts of hurting someone they loved, thoughts of violence toward strangers, thoughts of pushing people in front of trains. Thoughts so dark that most of them had never breathed a word about them to anyone. Rachman's conclusion was simple and extraordinary. Intrusive thoughts, including the darkest ones, are not a symptom. They are, and likely have always been, part of what it means to have a human mind. Here's the part that will stay with you. In 2014, researchers also confirmed something called the high place phenomenon, which the French had already given a far more beautiful name. L'appel du vide, the call of the void. It describes that fleeting impulse you feel when you're standing at a cliff edge, or on a tall building, or near a fast-moving train. The sudden, inexplicable urge to jump, even when you have no desire whatsoever to do so. Studies found that over 50% of people have experienced this. And here's the part that shocks most people. It was common even among people who had never, in their entire lives, had a suicidal thought. The researcher who studied it most closely, April Smith of Miami University, described the call of the void as a miscommunication in the brain. A safety signal misfiring. Your brain detects the danger of the height, sends an urgent alert, and somewhere in the translation that alert gets scrambled into an image of the very thing it was trying to warn you against. Her paper was titled, "An Urge to Jump Affirms the Urge to Live," because that's what the research found. The impulse isn't a death wish. It's a life instinct that got its wires crossed. Now I want to tell you the most counterintuitive thing in all of this. The finding that very few people ever talk about. The people who are most disturbed by their dark thoughts are not the most dangerous ones. They are the most moral ones. NPR's Alex Spiegel reported on this at length, and the psychologist she interviewed said it plainly. People who become consumed with guilt and horror over an intrusive violent thought have a problem that is almost the opposite of what they fear. Their moral identity is so strong, so central to who they are, that the thought feels catastrophic to them. Meanwhile, someone with genuinely dangerous tendencies wouldn't experience that horror at all. The thought wouldn't feel foreign. It wouldn't trigger shame. It would feel comfortable. Lee Baer, a Harvard psychologist who has written extensively on intrusive thoughts, described the actual warning sign this way. A thought is only concerning if the person doesn't feel upset by it, if it feels pleasurable rather than horrifying, if it feels aligned with who they are rather than completely at odds with it. So if you are horrified by your dark thought, if it feels like a betrayal of everything you stand for, that horror is not evidence of danger. It is evidence of your conscience working exactly as it should. The distress itself proves the thought is not you. And this brings us to the question that matters most. If suppressing the thought makes it worse, and if the thought itself doesn't mean anything dangerous, then what do you actually do with it? The answer comes from a branch of psychology called acceptance and commitment therapy, and it centers on a concept called cognitive diffusion. The premise is simple. Most of the power a dark thought holds over you doesn't come from the thought itself. It comes from the relationship you have with the thought, from the way you treat it as a fact, a truth, a revelation about who you really are. Diffusion is the practice of breaking that relationship, not by arguing with the thought, not by replacing it, but by stepping back from it and seeing it for what it actually is, a noise your brain made, a word, an event, not a verdict. What's remarkable is that one of the most effective diffusion techniques is nearly 90 years old. A psychologist named Titchener first described it in the early 20th century, and modern studies have confirmed it still works. The technique is almost offensively simple. You take the most disturbing thought you have, reduce it to a single word, and repeat that word rapidly for 30 to 60 seconds. You say it out loud, over and over, until it starts to sound bizarre, hollow, meaningless. What the research found is that this technique reduced both the emotional power and the believability of negative thoughts, more effectively than distraction, and more effectively than thought control. Because when you stop treating the thought as a signal and start treating it as a sound, the brain has nothing left to amplify. There are other approaches that work through the same mechanism. One of them is almost embarrassingly easy. Instead of thinking the dark thought, try saying, "I'm having the thought that," and then finish the sentence. Rather than, "My mind is broken," you say, "I'm having the thought that my mind is broken." Rather than, "I'm a terrible person," you say, "I'm having the thought that I'm a terrible person." That tiny linguistic shift, inserting those 5 words, does something neurologically real. It activates your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for language, executive function, and reasoning. And as that region lights up, it begins to inhibit the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, which is what generated the fear response in the first place. You are not talking yourself out of anything. You are literally using language to engage a neural circuit that turns down the volume of the threat signal. There is a related technique that sounds almost like a joke until you try it. Take the same dark thought and repeat it in a cartoon voice, a robot voice, the voice of a character from a children's show. What happens when you do this is the thought loses its authority. The emotional dressing it arrived in, the urgency, the dread, the weight, can't survive being delivered by a cartoon. It sounds absurd. Because it is absurd. The same principle applies to visualization. Imagining the thought as a leaf on a river and watching it drift away isn't spiritual performance. It's a cognitive exercise. It trains your brain to observe the thought passing through, rather than fusing with it, to see the thought as something that happened in your mind, not something that revealed your mind. The deeper principle behind all of this is a distinction that will change how you relate to every unwanted thought you ever have for the rest of your life. Psychologists call it the difference between cognitive fusion and cognitive diffusion. Fusion is when you look from the thought, when you see the world through it, when it becomes the lens, when its content feels like reality. Diffusion is when you look at the thought, when you observe it from outside, when you see it as a temporary mental event passing through your awareness. And the reason this matters so much is that your thoughts are not always accurate representations of reality. They don't need to be believed or disbelieved. They just need to be seen. When you become able to see a dark thought rather than become it, you step outside the cycle that has been feeding it. You stop giving it the resistance it needs to grow. There is a phrase from ACT therapy that captures this perfectly. Thank your brain for that thought, and move on. Not dismissing it, not suppressing it, not fighting it, acknowledging it with something close to affection. Yes, brain, I see you, I heard you, thank you. And then returning your attention to your life and your values. Here is the final thing I want you to understand. The fact that you are watching this, the fact that you looked for this, that you wanted to understand this, that the thought bothers you enough to want to face it, says something about you that no dark thought ever could. The thoughts that visit us in our most private moments are not our identity. They are events. Electrical storms passing through a complex and ancient brain, shaped by evolution, chemistry, experience, and chance. The mind that generated the thought, and the person who is horrified by it, are not the same thing. One is a function. The other is you. When you stop running from your darkest thought and turn to face it, not to accept its message, but to strip it of its authority, something genuinely changes. The brain learns there is no danger in the thought itself. The fear circuit quiets. The thought becomes smaller, not because you defeated it, but because you stopped giving it a war to win. That is what it means to face your darkest thought. Not to approve of it, not to understand it, just to see it clearly, without flinching, for exactly what it is.